Can we trust the Australian government's COVIDSafe contact tracing app?
And can Google and Facebook win everyone back from Zoom?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hi there, welcome back to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, the podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined, as always, by Alex Kidman, a man who's been passing the time by talking to a basketball called Wilson with a face paint on it. Together, they've been trying to find the worst content on streaming services. Alex, what's the worst thing you and Wilson have watched this week?
Look, Wilson gives me really, really bad advice. And so far, the most brain-dead thing that I've found available on Australian streaming services is on Amazon Prime Video. It's a show called Almost Impossible Game Show, where the intellectual rigour can best be described by one of the rounds where you have to try and catch cupcakes by punching yourself in the face.
Is it Japanese by any chance?
It is not.
Wow. But clearly inspired by Japanese game shows.
Quite possibly so.
So this week, we're joined in the studio by a new guest. It's Australian futurist, inventor, author, and columnist, Mark Pesce. Mark, welcome to the show. Are you working from home?
Yes, and I'm busily punching myself in the face. Thank you very much.
Aren't we all?
Apart from punching yourself in the face, what's been your secret to surviving the lockdown?
Look, I've always worked a lot from home anyway. This is a lot more working from home than I was doing before. And I'm getting a little anxious to go out and have meetings and coffee and all of the things that we're missing a lot. But I'm not one of those people who thrives in a very dense, connected office environment. I actually prefer a lot of thinking time. And so for me, this is working. But I feel for people who really need that kind of connected environment because they're suffering right now.
I'm sure most people never thought they'd miss meetings. A mate of mine's got a pair of work socks that it's got written on the side of the socks, "This meeting is bullshit." And he likes to wear them to certain meetings. And he needs a new one that says, this Zoom call is bullshit.
No, that has to be the background. It's just when you flip your background to "this Zoom call is bullshit." I now have one of my friends gave me the "this is fine" GIF, just the background.
Oh, yeah.
And I drop that into Zoom calls now.
Nice. So Mark's joined us this week to chat about the Australian government's new COVIDSafe app for tracing people who've come into contact with the coronavirus. But first, we're going to catch up with Sydney Morning Herald tech editor Tim Biggs to talk about the big push from Google and Facebook to win everyone back who's flocked to Zoom during the lockdown. So, Tim, welcome back to the show, mate. It's been a few, let's say, big months for Zoom, but a lot of their competitors are now thinking we want a slice of the pie back, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that Facebook and Google and Microsoft and everybody were kicking themselves when Zoom came out of nowhere to become the sort of de facto, working from home communication app. So they've sort of had to redouble their efforts, I think, to capture this new market.
Yeah. And what have we seen from, Facebook for starters? What have they got in mind? How they think they're going to out-Zoom Zoom?
Yeah, so Facebook's basically just expanding on Messenger at the moment with a feature called Messenger Rooms, which is it's a big messenger chat for up to 50 people. And so the idea is you create the rooms, you invite who you want. You can send out the link publicly like you can on Zoom. You don't need to have a Facebook account to join. And you can do, all sorts of Facebooky things like sharing the room, on your wall or feed so, other people can join in. And I think they're looking to expand it as well to WhatsApp and Instagram and their portal devices. So at the moment, it looks like it's something maybe they've hacked together pretty quick. But the idea is if you're on Facebook, there's an easy way to jump into a big conference with everyone.
50 people. I'd struggle to think of 50 people I want to be in the same room as in real life. 50 people.
Yeah, right.
50
we've met
people
you,
on
Adam.
Facebook just sounds mad. Yes.
And I mean, there's got to be a limit to the number of people who are willing to conduct their business over Facebook as well. So it's
absolutely.
Yeah, there's probably going to have to wait for a little while for them to prove whether it's worthwhile or not. But it's there.
Do you think they mean it as a business tool, or are they trying to win back the consumer customers who they've lost because consumers are using Zoom, which is meant to be a business tool?
There's certainly people who have latched onto Zoom as a way to get in touch with, family and friends, especially because, Zoom, you jump into a meeting, it gives you a link, you can send the link, other people can click it and they go straight to it. There's not really any setup beyond that. So I think that's the kind of thing that Facebook's looking at. Of course, with Zoom, as we've seen, that kind of accessibility leads to a host of privacy issues as well, which Facebook doesn't have the best track record with. And the idea that anyone without logging into Facebook could potentially jump into the calls probably isn't a great look either.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I'm putting this up on my wall, or if someone else puts it up on their wall, having got the link, is there much to stop random pantsless strangers from showing up?
Yeah, so I think the way it works is the person who hosts it really needs to make sure they go in and tweak their settings, just like anything on Facebook. They need to go into their privacy settings and make sure they've locked it down. If they only want specific people in there, if they don't want it to show up on other people's walls, you need to sort of curate that a bit to make sure it's doing what you think it's doing.
The interesting thing you said in there is that people don't need a Facebook account to join. And I think Skype has recently done the same thing where you can now make a Skype call to someone who doesn't have a Skype account. Was that the big appeal for Zoom, is if you wanted to ring someone, they didn't have to muck around at creating an account before you could talk?
I think that's it. I think with a lot of the sort of stuff we're seeing now, it's all about, having the service run in a browser and having people just be able to click a link. And if you're on a phone, it might send you to download an app. But if you're on the computer, it'll just open up and you'll be connected to everybody. So I think people really like that immediacy. And it's clear because Zoom's consumer base is still growing, right? But also you've started to see companies, for example, telling people you absolutely can't use Zoom just because that option is there and people tend to take it, and it's not the most secure option.
And Google's also made changes to Google Meet. Now, I get confused. There's Google Meet and there's Google Hangout. Hangouts is like the consumery one and Meet is like the businessy one, yes?
Yeah, so I think it's going to pretty soon be the same thing. In typical Google way, they've been sort of integrating it together for a while. I think Hangouts is what it was called originally, and the enterprise one was called like Meet Hangouts or something like that. I think
that's a bad name.
Yeah,
that's a very bad name. That's what we're trying to stop happening in video calls. Meet Hangouts is what we don't want in our video calls.
Maybe it was Hangouts Meet. I don't know what it was, but the fact is, Meet is a bad name once you say it out loud. It looks fine on paper, but yes. So
why do they call you Meet?
Google Meets Meet is going to be the thing, right? It's going to take over Hangouts. They've announced, to get back on track, they've announced that the service is going to be available to everyone. So currently it's only available to enterprise users or education users, people who are paying for it, basically. So they're rolling it out to everybody. And the thing with Google is that, with Zoom, the thing is you're trading convenience for security. With Google, I mean, we've always been doing that with Google, but since we're doing it already, there is a degree of security built in because we're already logged into our Google accounts usually. So you can pretty confidently say, okay, everyone needs to have a Google account to come in. No rando who's not signed in can arrive. And for consumers, I think the way it's going to work is that when you set up an event, it'll basically be on Google Calendar. You can say who's going to be there. Those people can get in with a single click on the link. Everybody else, if they find the link, they can go to the meeting, but they won't go straight in. It'll have a message asking the host if they'd like to let them in or not.
Presumably, though, with Zoom, they're not analyzing your video calls to serve you ads in the same way that Google is. Isn't the trade-off there the security versus privacy one?
Well, Google has actually said that they're not going to do that with the video service. I'm pretty sure they don't do it to paying customers, but they have said they won't do it on consumers either. None of the audio or video collected is going to be used to target ads. But obviously, Google does have a vested interest in making sure that you are signed in to your Google account and using your Google account as much as possible so they can follow you around the web and get all that nice, juicy goodness that they use to power their entire company.
Do you think they've left their run too late? Have too many people moved to Zoom, or are now too many people flowing back from Zoom so it's the right time to be trying to win these people over?
Yeah, it's tough because you really are looking at a fractured ecosystem, even if Zoom is, the sort of one that everyone talks about at the moment. I guess the problem is when you're starting a call, you need to know that you can send it to someone and they're going to be able to jump in and not going to have to go, then I have to download a thing or I have to, do something. So I think there's an opportunity there for Google if they can just get some people using it, because it works in the browser, it works on an app. It's very easy to send it out and have people join, assuming they have some sort of Google account. And I mean, I've been using Meet for a long time because I use it for work, and it's great. They've got all sorts of weird googly stuff. They use AI for noise cancellation, for captions, for low light mode, all that sort of stuff. The problem is going to be convincing people to start using it, I think.
So while Australia and indeed a lot of places around the world debate when and where they should ease lockdown restrictions to control the spread of coronavirus, this week the federal government's COVIDSafe contract tracing app finally hit the Google and Apple app stores. After a slightly bumpy launch where it was available before they could actually register anyone, and despite lingering concerns around privacy and security, more than 3 million Australians have reportedly downloaded the app so far. Mark, did you expect Australians to embrace the app so quickly?
I think the government has effectively promised that if you download the app, you will get your freedoms back. And they've radically oversold that, but I really feel like that is part of the drive to uptake, that we are so over these restrictions that anything that's being held out to us as an answer to that is going to be grasped.
So they're saying that we need a 40% take up. So that'd be roughly 10 million people on the back of an envelope. Do you think we're on track to maybe get there? Do you getting the vibe that enough people are going to go for it?
So we've hit probably we're going to hit 3 million-ish this week. I think that getting to 5 million is probably not going to be hard. I think getting that second 5 million will take a consistent, dedicated effort from a lot of parties. And I think that a lot of the tech community is really waiting for the source code drop, which will probably be in about another 10 days. Even though we've seen the source code, at least the Android version, opened up because it's very easy to disassemble Android APK files. And everything seems to be doing what it says it is doing. I think that we're looking for the continuation of the good faith effort from the government. And actually, probably someone in the tech community starting to file the first bug report. Hey, you did something wrong here, or here's a way to make it safer, or whatever it might be. But I'm also hearing from people who have it installed on fairly high-end Android devices that it's quitting, or that it's issuing battery warnings. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether it works correctly in the background on iOS. So I have a feeling that this is a 1.0 release, and we just have to admit that, in fact, this is going to be a process of improvement and engagement, and that's how you get to that 10 million number. You don't just sort of wave a magic wand.
Yeah. I guess you can split the Australian public into three categories. There are the people who are going to rush out and install this on pretty much day one, and we've seen a lot of them come along already. There are the people at the other end of the spectrum. There's no way in hell they're ever going to install this on a computer. Now, those two, a phone.
Barnaby.
Yes. So those two categories were pretty much always going to take care of themselves. It's the ones in the middle. It's the swinging voters. Yeah. What is it that those swinging voters are waiting for? What kind of things not just the tech people like us, but maybe the not so tech people as well. What are the questions they're asking, and what are they waiting for? What will be the threshold for them to go, right, I'm in?
I think at that point, it's going to be looking at what your peers are doing. Are your peers installing the app? And in fact, before the app was released, there was a very earnest conversation, which I did not initiate, among my friends who are sort of technical, but not excessively technical, about should we install it or not. And so I think a lot of it's really going to be Australians watching one another as we make a collective determination that this is the right thing to do. And I think that there's a point at which things will be trustworthy enough. And at that point, I don't know if there's going to be peer pressure per se, although Australians are really good at applying peer pressure. But I think there'll be a consensus that it was the right thing to do.
There's a usual thing where you want to wait for about version 3 of a software before you get on board with it.
Service pack 1.
Yeah. But obviously in this case, it's not necessarily the best idea in terms of the intent of the app, is it? We want to be getting people on this as soon as possible in terms of what the app is meant to do, trust issues aside.
Yeah, I mean, I think for two reasons. One of them is there's now essentially 3 million beta testers because this did not really have what we would think of as a proper beta test cycle. I kind of know some of the folks who were involved in it. It was a sprint to get it finished and released on the weekend. And with all of the, we've all developed software. We know what that means. We know that although this is a straightforward app in some ways, there's always going to be loose bits flying around, and you won't see it until it's deployed at scale on a whole bunch of different devices in a whole bunch of different situations, that you're actually going to start to understand what you did wrong. So we really do need to take a look at this as a process. And I feel as though if it's communicated that this is a process toward doing something that will be broadly helpful, then you have the chance to actually engage that second 5 million people so that they see that this is a good thing that Australians are participating in. And I feel like that's the missing element right now.
Yeah. What about in terms of privacy? What kind of assurances are we getting from the government? And do you think that they actually stack up? Do you think they're doing a good job of conveying that? And can we trust them?
In terms of everything that we've seen from the analysis of the disassembled Android app, all of that is exactly as was being said. All right. So in the sense that it collects this data silently, securely, and is not released until the person whose phone it is says, I have had a positive diagnosis. I am now about to release this data. Then it goes off to the relevant state health authority, and they apparently have the decryption key for it, so no one else can read it. Now, all of that seems to be exactly as advertised. My big question here is that because we're using Amazon's server infrastructure, which is located in Australia, but Amazon is a company that is incorporated and domiciled in the United States, does the NSA or equivalent organization have the right to get a FISA court order? These are these international, basically the wiretapping court orders, to be able to take the data off of Amazon-owned services in Australia. And that, to me, I actually would like to get an international law lawyer around to get them to give me a read on, is that the potential hole here? Because the government's closed that hole via legislation. Australians cannot access this data for any other purpose, full stop. But the entity itself is not Australian and therefore may not be covered in the same way by Australian law.
I haven't written about this for a while, but the last time I talked about that, I wrote about that kind of data jurisdiction. I was pretty sure there's something, maybe the Patriot Act or something like that, that basically gave them the right to tell US businesses that it doesn't matter where you are in the world or what you're doing, you're a US company, therefore you hand over that data.
Correct. And this is why I would like to have an international lawyer look into this, because it feels to me like that is an unacceptable security risk that could be mitigated with a local provider. And I totally know, I mean, the thing is, I have friends who work for Amazon Web Services. It's an amazing company. They do amazing work. This may not be exactly the right data set to have sitting on their servers is all.
Mark, I wanted to lean on your expertise with Bluetooth specifically. I was listening to your Next Billion Seconds podcast where you talked about this particular app, and I'd certainly encourage all of our listeners to do likewise. But you talked about the kind of the transmission rate and capture rate of Bluetooth. And one of the differences that this app seems to have from the Singapore app, based on that early pull down of the Android code, is that the randomized identifier that you get in Australia is good for, I think it's 2 hours, whereas the Singapore one is 15 minutes. Is that actually significant? Is that something that people should be worried about, or just a minor detail?
You ask a good question, and I think the thing is that you probably have to subject that to a really interesting statistical analysis to know for sure whether that's giving you so much specific data that it allows, because none of the data is locative, and we need to keep that in mind. It's all relative, right? It's all about who you're around, not where you are when you're around them. The question is, if you have a longer sample, because essentially what you're saying is we're having a 2-hour sample with the same ID versus a 15-minute sample, does that then reveal more in the data? And you'd need a good data scientist to be able to poke at it for a while. And again, that's the kind of thing that you might not discover until a year or two later. Oh, look, we could de-anonymize this in such a way because of that window. And so I think the answer is, I don't know, but it's a good question to ask.
I can just thinking out loud, the difference between 15 minutes and 2 hours is the difference between being in one place and commuting from home to work.
I completely agree with you. Yes, the question is that significant enough in terms of, I guess, whether there's there's someone who's actually trying to do more than just trace your contacts, but is actually trying to trace out where you're going and why you're going.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know. What you'd want to do is go take a look at the source code and see if there's a comment on that particular line where that constant is being set, because that's a constant value in the code, right? And so theoretically, that's well documented, and you'd be able to go and ask them. Or once the source code is released, we should be able to go, why is this constant set to this value? Why is that the way you did it? And I feel like, again, this is the whole process of engagement here. Understanding why decisions were made a certain way allows you to have some transparency and probity around the functioning of the app.
We've mentioned how it's version 1 of the app, and obviously it's in development and it will presumably get better and change over time. It's also against the backdrop of this whole framework that Apple and Google are developing. And in fact, on the day we're recording now, I think it's been reported they've just started pushing that out ahead of, I think it's a mid-May release.
Yep.
Going total devil's advocate here, what if I were to say they should have waited until mid-May and just done the Apple-Google thing? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Look, that would have been my preference overall for a couple of reasons. One of them is because all of the apps that exist right now are essentially fighting operating system provisions that try to shut down Bluetooth apps that will suck down the battery because they're running in the background all the time and using the radio all the time and all of that, right? And those operating systems are highly engineered to conserve power. So one of the major primary objectives of a smartphone operating system is to conserve battery for as long as possible. So part of it is that these APIs have been designed with that in mind. Part of it's also that they've been designed with a high degree of anonymity in mind, which coming from Google is shocking and pleasing, but surprising nonetheless.
Sure.
I guess there was a need to move ahead of that. What I think we're going to have to come to understand is, will we see a migration to the new systems as they're released? I would hope that we would see really a major revision 2 where we adopt those systems, but those systems collect their data and release their data differently. And the question is whether, like the Germans announced they were going to do an app and they announced they weren't going to do it the Apple way, and then they've changed their mind this week. We'll have an opportunity to actually take a look at it that way. It feels as though all of the apps that we do, if we don't do it in concert with the API providers, will essentially be doing what they can to trick these operating systems into doing the things that we want them to do, and we'll probably never be able to do them that well as a result.
Yeah, Apple and Google have that kind of inside track on this kind of stuff, I suppose.
Well, it's their operating system, so they clearly do. Yeah.
Is it likely, though, would it be possible to update the Australian app, switch in Apple and Google's way of doing it on the background, yet not lose the consistency of the data, so you don't have this break in the data set where you can't track anyone across that break? Or else you've just reset everyone to 0.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Or what you do is because you're keeping a sort of that 21-day log, you sort of wait till that log is exhausted and then you go over to the new system if someone has already done something like that. This becomes a very interesting exercise then in user experience design and in product design. And that may also mean that they don't want to do it because it produces too many moving pieces for them. But if we're using an app like this, not for a month, because I think a lot of people think, oh, this is just going to be for a little while. But if we're using it for, say, the next 9 months, 12 months, then it actually does make sense to continuously improve and continuously migrate and think of this again as a conversation around inclusion, transparency, and continuous improvement, which I don't know if the government knows how to do that particularly well. This is very much, I think, an experimental process for them. And I'm pleased most of the time until they make an own goal, like deciding it's going to be mandatory and then saying, oh, no, we don't mean it's going to be mandatory. Most of the time they've been making the right noises, but you can tell how unfamiliar those sounds are to them.
A lot of the messaging has been really messy, to put it incredibly kindly.
Yes.
And they've got such good form. I mean, it was the same with the metadata debate. It was the same with all this stuff. They just can't help themselves but explain things badly and then wonder why people get concerned.
Yes. Yes, and in this case, there's, you're not trying to invoke the specter of terrorism or foreign interference or all of those other things. You're trying to invoke public health, which is an exceptionally noble goal. But if you are unpracticed at the at the language of framing the decisions you're making around public health rather than security, then you're going to make those kinds of fumbles with your language. And you can tell that they're learning how to do this right, and they are certainly not always getting it right. And I mean, just the prime minister yesterday was very much sort of talking about this is the equivalent of putting sunscreen on, which frames the app as something that will protect you in real time from being infected, which the app categorically does not do. The app is always looking backward. It will tell you once you're infected all of the other people who need to be warned about that infection, or that you potentially have been infected by someone who you were in contact with. But it will do nothing to prevent you from being infected. And we need to be very clear about that. So it's not a protective in the same way that sunscreen is.
I did notice, and a hat tip to a longtime friend of the show, Matthew Powell, who said on Facebook that he's concerned that either the Prime Minister doesn't know how the app works, doesn't know how sunscreen works, or worse yet, doesn't know how either of them work.
Mark, you mentioned the whole fact that we will probably be running this for some time. One of the biggest concerns, and I've certainly noticed this myself on the small occasions where I've used it, is that Bluetooth is fairly naturally a battery hog. Is there much that can be technically done about that? Because it is just a radio, ultimately.
So, and again, I think this is very much where the Google and Apple APIs come in, because what they'll do is they'll turn the radio on only when it's going to do a scan, only for the duration of the scan, particularly if it's BLE. BLE does very low power scans. So, if you have an older phone which has Bluetooth but not BLE, then you're right. You're definitely going to notice a drain on your battery. But this is one reason why deep operating system integration is the kind of thing that you're going to need at a very sort of fundamental level here, because we are going to be asking people, I suspect they're going to be giving up sort of 25% of their battery life when they're using this app during the day, which sort of
least. Well,
that's not going to go down well.
Maybe the onboard API version. I was running it on quite new, the newer version of the iPhone SE this week, and it by itself it ate up 10% of my battery life within an hour.
Oh,
the people who sell power banks are going to be very excited. I can hear David Wolf rubbing his hands together right now. Going, right.
But this is the problem. If it is killing people's batteries, then people will stop running the app.
They'll stop using it.
And so again, this is part of what I think this learning process is, and why I'm not particularly fussed about the fact that we'll only have maybe by this time next week, maybe 5 million downloads on the app, and we might need more, because I still feel like there's a lot we need to learn and do right around this. Yeah. And I feel as though it's up to both the folks in the tech community to go, look at this as a process. Don't worry that it didn't work right on day one, but also in the government to actually be active participants in, yes, we can always make this better, and we will always make this better, so that there's a sense that this is at least being dealt with, right? It's kind of like calling customer support and just getting a busy signal, or Centrelink, right? That's the last thing you want.
Wouldn't inflict that on anybody,
No.
So there's a school of thought that says we should just shut up and stop having this conversation, and everyone should just install it for the greater good. What do you say to those people? The greater good.
Look, I feel as though this is an engagement in a conversation about the kind of data collection that the nation will willingly do for its own good, not for the government's good, because this really isn't about the government's good. This is about public health. And that because of that, actually, we should be asking hard questions, and we should be asking hard questions, as Genevieve Bell put it on the podcast, at the most inopportune times. Right. And that's actually part of this, because it's doing that and it's probing those weak points makes it better for everyone, not just the folks who adopted it right away, but for the folks that are going to come to it late, who are going to be the 7th or 8th millionth person to install this, because they're going to have had the benefit of all of those hard questions and all of that probing that all of the rest of us are doing. They will inherit something that is better as a result.
One of my concerns is that while you say it's for public health concerns, really that it's going to be used as a political tool by people who just want to kickstart the economy. They're not that concerned about public health. Just get out there and die for the shareholders. But their argument will be, we've got this app now, you're perfectly safe, slap on your sunscreen and get out there.
Right. And I feel like that's another area of debate that we'll have to cross. You know, and we've identified, what is it? It's testing, it's tracking. What's the third element? Oh, why am I forgetting what the third element is there? But there's the three elements that are necessary to really get all of this working right, to be able to sort of stay on top of possible outbreaks. And there is that kind of push from certain people who don't, I think, are either willfully overlooking or don't actually understand that this is not just about a small percentage of people dying. This is about literally burning through your entire health care system, which is what they've done in Italy. It's what they've done in New York. And that those health systems will not work right again for close to a generation. So it's that other price that all of us pay. And as well, the enormous, because people who end up in ICU with COVID-19 infections end up with permanent disabilities because, as we're learning day to day, the virus picks particular organs and just goes bananas, whether that's your brain or that's your kidneys or that's your lungs or that's your, we have a running list now, and that list keeps on getting longer. And the number of people who will end up with long-term issues because of this as well means that if you're just thinking about reopening the economy, you actually haven't calculated the full bill. You've left off all of the liabilities and you've only accounted the benefits.
Just to spin back on something else that you were talking about before in terms of updates, it strikes me there's also a bit of a challenge in hitting that 5 or even 10 million figure, especially if we shift to the Apple and Google framework. Because on the Apple side, for example, it's tied into an upcoming iOS release, which means you've got to have an iPhone that can take it just to qualify. Do we jump around that by running 2 apps simultaneously?
Yeah, and this is, it was already announced, I think in Ars Technica last week, that there are going to be around 2 billion phones that are out there in the world. And I don't know what percentage in Australia, but just of the number of smartphones there are out there in the world, that simply will never be able to run the apps with the APIs that Google and Apple are providing. Whether or not they run on this app, and when I was doing the ABC radio on Monday, a woman called in because she had Android 5.3, which I think is like 5 or 6 years old, and it won't run the app. So it's clear that, in fact, some of the people who would probably need it most, which might be older folks who have older model smartphones because they don't update them all the time or they don't keep their operating systems updated, in fact, that they may, in fact, be this kind of black hole of surveillance that where it's most needed. And this is part of the problem with pointing to technology as the solution, which again, the politicians, I feel, have done too much of. It is part of a solution, but it doesn't save us from social distancing. It doesn't save us from just kind of remembering where we were and when we were there, or as Jacinda Ardern suggested, just keeping a diary.
Memory can be a bit of an unreliable tool, though. I mean, surely some of the idea of this is that it's better than your memory because your phone can know where you've been or where you've been in proximity to. Sorry, I should not make that location mistake in sentences myself.
Absolutely. And particularly if you've just had a COVID-19 diagnosis, your memory is going to be scrambled anyway because you're probably sick and you're also probably scared. And this is designed to be an aid to that memory. But to point to it and to say that it's the solution is to ignore the fact that there are people and circumstances that are simply not covered by that solution, and that we have to have all of those other very old-fashioned, very human solutions in place at the same time. So it's not an either or, it's a both and.
So, Mark, should be a fairly obvious question. Have you installed it? Are you running it?
I have not installed the app yet. I am waiting, as I've said publicly, for the source code release so I can take a look at it, because I tend to run iOS devices. My main smartphone is an iOS smartphone. I really do want to take a look at the code. I really do want friends to take a look at the code. I want all of that and again, I think this is more me making a statement about transparency. It's okay, you'll show me yours, now I'll show you mine.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Mark for making time for the show this week.
Thank you very much.
And Mark, if people want to find your work online, where can they do that?
So the best thing to do is to go check out my podcast, The Next Billion Seconds. You can look for that in your favorite podcasting app or go to nextbillionseconds.com. I'm also doing a daily series of videos called The Next 100 Seconds. You can look for that on YouTube. Just search YouTube Next 100 Seconds. You can see one every day where I'm talking about what's going on in the world and how COVID is changing us.
And if people want to find you on social media?
At @mpesci on Twitter or on LinkedIn. I don't use Facebook.
And also a big thanks to Tim Biggs from the Sydney Morning Herald for dropping by the show as well.
And of course, our regular listeners can catch up with us on Twitter at Vertical Hold or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page, although obviously not Mark.
As always, thanks again, everyone, for listening. Try to stay home, try to stay safe, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. All right, we'll just stop there for a second because it looks like Alex has dropped out. Now, we could pretty much just cut what we were saying there, and I think that's probably about as much as we want, but I'm very reluctant to hit stop recording when Alex is not back in the recording.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can just hold on for a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ring him on my phone.
Wait, I can hear both of you. Can you hear each other?
No, I can't hear Adam at all.
Can you hear Alex?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Okay, you're both talking to me. I think
it's like a seance. No, but I need you, Tim, and listen to the spirits. Can you hear Alex? What is he telling you?
Alex, are you okay to stop this and wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm fine if Adam wants to hit the stop button.
Okay.
Do so far.
Adam, you should hear this from my
end.
This
is very strange. Adam, it is okay to stop with the big stop button, I'm being told.
All right, cool.
Voices from the beyond telling me that it is okay.